Hi, welcome to the BYU-Idaho Tutoring Center videos. Today we're going to be talking about the population growth formulas. So we're going to be focusing on two major ones, the exponential growth model and the logistic growth model, and how to use the equations to do some calculations and some just basic principles behind them. So in ecology and science, we like to look at how a population is going to be changing over time. That gives us clues to kind of interactions that are going on with the population and its environment. And so there's been a lot of math that's been done to show that if we had populations in ideal unlimited environments in which they were allowed to grow unchecked, they could grow quite rapidly. So we see that there is this potential for populations to grow because individuals are producing offspring and there's more offspring than them themselves. So if we were to think about this logically, the change in the population, which we would then add to the current population to get the new population size, or the amount of population growth that would happen, would be equal to the births plus the number of immigrants coming into the population minus the deaths and the number of immigrants. So people are things exiting the population. But for the sake of this class, we're not really going to be dealing with immigrants and emigrants. It would give us a more complete model of this growth, but it's a little bit more complicated, so we're going to not deal with those. So with this change, we see that the change in the number or our population over some period of time is going to be the births minus the deaths. So the little triangle is a delta sign. It means change. And then n is equal to the population and t is equal to the time. So over some time period, the change in our population is going to be our births minus our deaths. That logically makes sense. However, sometimes we like to, we're going to get a little bit more complex. So we're going to be looking at the per capita birth rate and per capita death rate. And so this is just the number of births that we had in a certain time period over the number of individuals in the population. And so, for example, if we had 34 births in a year and there was 1,000 members in our population, then the per capita birth rate or per capita birth rate per year would be 0.034 because we take 34 and we divide it by 1,000. We kind of can do the same thing with death rates. And so we can also go in reverse. If we're given the per capita death rate and the number of individuals in the population, we can predict how many births it would be per the time period that it's given. So for example, if we were told that the per capita birth rate was 0.034 and we knew that we had 100 individuals in our population, we could guess that in that year there would be about 3.4 individuals that were born, so like 3 for rounding. And then we go one step further, and well, actually first, if big B, which is how we just represent the births, and little b is the per capita birth rate, and little d is the per capita death rate, then we could change this equation from the big B and the minus the big D to per capita death rate times the number of individuals minus the per capita death rate times the number of individuals. We like to get one step further, and we talk about the per capita rate of increase. And the per capita rate of increase is just the per capita birth rate minus the per capita death rate, and that's what we represent as R. So when we change all this and reduce these, we get that the change in the population over some period of time is going to equal R, the per capita rate of increase, times the population size. And R can be very insightful. It can let us know if the population is growing, which occurs when R is greater than 0, it's a positive number. If R is less than 0 or a negative number, then we have a decline in the population. And if R is 0, then we're at 0 population growth, so we don't have any population growth going up. Keep in mind, though, that if R equals 0 and we have no population growth, that doesn't mean that we don't have any births or deaths going on. It just means that the number of births and the number of deaths are equal. We always are going to have birth and death going on in a population. So we need to do maybe a practice problem with this equation so we can get a little bit better at it. So on a test or on homework, you may be asked to use this formula. Real fast, something to note is that if we were to graph the change in population size over time, we would find that it forms sort of a J-shaped curve. This is because it's exponential. So as we continue to grow at the same rate year after year after year, we're going to be increasing our number of individuals in our population because more individuals can produce more offspring. So let's do a practice problem. We're going to find the population after 4 generations. If there's a 0.5 capital rate of increase, and that's per generation, and we have a starting population of 500. So if we start off, we're going to find our first change. So I'm just going to kind of change it and just do the change in the population growth. Is going to equal 0.5 times 500. When we do that, we get 250. So that's our change, but we have to add that to our current population size to get our new population size. So our new population size is going to be 750. And so now when we do generation 2 and multiply it by this new rate, we're going to get, should be about 375. So now we have an increase of 375. So if you notice, we had a greater increase with a greater population size because, again, more individuals can produce more offspring. So we're just going to keep doing this again, but make sure you add this 375 to the 750 from before, which gives us 1,125. And we multiply that by 0.5, we're going to get 562.5. I'm going to keep that decimal there. Usually go round because you can't have half of an individual in population. So now when we add that to our 1,025, our new population size is 1,687.5. We multiply that by 0.5. Sorry, I'm running off the board here. We get a population growth of 843.75 individuals. And if we add that to our population size that we already had, then we're going to have 22,531.25, but I'm just going to round, individuals after 4 generations. And so you can see this exponential growth that we're increasing with each generation. So just make sure, again, when you're doing these problems, that you remember to add the change in population to the current population to get the new population size. But something to keep in mind about exponential growth is it's based on this idea that we have ideal unlimited environments, that we can just continue growing. But that in reality isn't the case. Eventually, we're going to run out of resources, we're going to run out of space, we're going to run out of competition, and we're going to have things start die off because they can't survive if there's too many individuals around. Or we're not going to be having as many births because the individuals can't survive to reproduce. And so this is where the logistic growth model comes into play, the model that more accurately describes what happens in nature. And so it's based on this idea of carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the max population size that an environment can support. And so that's just based on lots of factors, how much nutrients is available, water, competition, habitats or areas for them to live. And so we represent it with a big K. And so when we factor this into our exponential growth model, we get this new logistic growth model equation. And it tells us that the change in the population over some time is going to be our rate times the number of individuals we had, times our carrying capacity minus the number of individuals over our carrying capacity. So that may be a lot to take in, but it logically makes sense. Because if you think about it, as n gets bigger and closer to k, this is going to become a smaller number, and thus this whole thing is going to become a smaller number. And when we multiply this smaller decimal type number by these two numbers, we're going to have a smaller rate of increase. Whereas if n is very small, not close to the carrying capacity at all, this whole thing is going to become bigger, and thus we can have more growth. And so if k ever equals n, then this is going to equal 0, and this whole thing is going to equal 0, and then this whole thing is going to equal 0, and so then our growth is going to stop because we've reached our carrying capacity. And so the graph tends to look more S-shaped. We start off with some kind of exponential type growth, a lot of growth, and then we sort of level out as we start to reach carrying capacity. Keep in mind though that this isn't a perfect representation. We don't see this all the time. A lot of times what can happen is the carrying capacity can grow and grow and grow, and it dips up above. The population can grow and grow and grow, and it dips up above carrying capacity, but then the environment can't support that many individuals, and so a lot of individuals in the population will die off, and then it will fall back down, and maybe we'll come back up again, and eventually we'll kind of level out to carrying capacity. That's more common than we see in nature. However, this isn't perfect either. Nothing really in science is perfect, surprise, surprise, because this makes some assumptions. And one of the assumptions it makes is that with more individuals, we have the same amount of detrimental effect on the population. So we're saying, hey, we add more individuals, that means that more things aren't going to be likely to get the nutrients and the environment that they need. But this isn't always the case. One example of this is the allele effect, which says that sometimes populations or individuals will have difficulty surviving if their population is too small. So sometimes we need kind of a larger population for individuals to survive. So for example, if you have some sort of plant or flower that needs shelter from other plants and flowers from the wind to survive, and having a small population isn't necessarily going to be beneficial, and as we increase the population size, it might actually increase its chance of survival for a little bit, but then if we continue to decrease too much, then it might decrease it again. So just keep in mind that the impact that a growing population size can change. But for the most part, we're going to just be making this assumption and doing these calculations this way. So let's do another example. We're going to kind of go back to the example from earlier, except we're going to add on the carrying capacity. So we still have an initial population of 500, and we have a growth rate of 0.5. So let's only do it for 2 generations though, and we'll just compare it to the first 2 generations that we had over here. So we're going to start off, and we're going to have our change in our population size is going to equal 0.5 times 500 times our 1,000 minus 500 over 1,000. I'm just going to separate the board here. So when we do this, this should equal 0.5. 1,000 minus 500 is 500. 500 divided by 1,000 is a half. That's 0.5. So 0.5 times 0.5 times 500 equals 125. So that's going to be our growth. And so when we add that to our original, and we're always to do that, we're going to have 175. Now I want you to notice something. The first time we did this, we had a growth in the population of 250. This was when we had unlimited growth, that we could have exponential growth. When we add this carrying capacity, it's only 125. It's half as much. So that's pretty interesting. So let's do it one more time with our new 725. So if we do this again, we'll have our 0.5 times, 625. I don't know what I was writing there. And then we're going to have 1,000 minus 625 over 1,000 again. So when we do 1,000 minus 625 divided by 1,000, we get 0.375. Multiply that by 0.5 and 625. And then we get 117.1875. And we would round that to 117 because you can't have half an individual. And so if you notice again, before, when we did our second round, we had 375 as our population growth. But now it's like 117, which is less. And it's also less population growth than the 125. So if you notice, we're actually not having as much population growth because we're getting closer to the carrying capacity. So now we can add this to our 625. And when we do that, we would get some new population size of about 742. You could keep growing, and if you did it again, you would probably have even less population growth because we're getting even closer to carrying capacity. So that's the logistic growth model. The last thing I want to touch on today was how we use this logistic growth model to look at life histories. So there's kind of two evolutionary things we look at individuals. There's K-selected individuals and R-selected individuals. And this is based on the environment that they're kind of living and what's going on and what types of characteristics they have that help them survive. So K-selected individuals, we're looking at carrying capacity, that's what K stands for. So these individuals are probably going to be living in some environment that's around its carrying capacity. So because of this, they're going to be longer lived and they're going to have fewer offspring. There's going to be more competition in their area, and they're going to be density dependent, so the amount of individuals is going to greatly affect them. That's the competition. So they're going to have fewer offspring because they have to compete, and they're going to be trying to help their offspring survive by having more parent care. And so because of this, they tend to be more of the type 1 individuals with that more parent care. We're not going to have as much death early on, and then later on there's going to be more death. And so they tend to be kind of more of these interoperity organisms, but that's how they reproduce. And so that's K-selected. Then R-selected is kind of the reverse. This is we just have lots of almost more exponential growth happening because there's not a lot of other individuals in the population around, and so there's not a lot of competition for resources, and they're not near their carrying capacity at all. So they're density independent. They can keep growing and it's not really going to affect them. They have more offspring, but they tend to be shorter lived. They're just having as many offspring as they can. They're opportunistic, taking this advantage of this not your carrying capacity at all to grow and to produce. And so they tend to also be type 3 because they have these more offspring. They're going to produce a lot of offspring early on. A lot of them might die because the environment is really unpredictable, and thus they are going to have that type 3 curve. And then they tend to be more of the similarity. They have shorter lives, so they're unpredictable, so they're just going to have one big reproduction event where they're going to reproduce with a ton of offspring. And so just make sure you know the difference between K-selected and R-selected and be able to identify different individuals in different scenarios. That's really all for today. I hope it was helpful. I hope you can better understand how the exponential and logistic growth models work and how to use these formulas in calculations. And then again, just really know the difference between these two, because you probably will be given some sort of example where you'll have to identify the difference between them. Thank you so much for watching and have a fantastic day.